Hi, welcome. We're so glad you're all here. And I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. On behalf of North Seattle College, we acknowledge that we occupy the traditional ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Duwamish tribe, a people that are still here, continuing to honor and bring to light their ancient heritage. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, dialogue, and learning space. We ask that we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here.
And may even be on this Zoom gathering space.
Exactly, thank you. So I'm gonna just introduce our guest, Andre Jackson. Okay, welcome and thank you for coming, all y'all. There's a lot of you here. As I've said before, in such a time when we are kept in place out of necessity, a lovely byproduct is that we can take advantage of technology to have people who are not in our local vicinity come and speak to us and with us. For the next couple of quarters, the NSC Art Gallery has built a visiting artist lecture series around bringing in artists from around the country. Today, we hold the third lecture in this series. It is a privilege to introduce to you to today's visiting artist, Andre Terrell Jackson. Andre Terrell Jackson earned their BA in fashion design from Albright College and their MFA in fibers from Savannah College of Art and Design. They have had their work in many solo and group exhibitions around the country, including a recent solo exhibition entitled Andre Terrell Jackson, Crowns, part of Queer Threads, Curious Spaces in Washington, DC. Andre was an artist in residence at Guildhall of East Hampton, New York, where they spent time researching masculinity through the intersection of race, gender, and sexual orientation. Their writings have been published in various places from the Textile Society of America to colorblock.org and include the following titles: The Conspicuous Trap of Desire in the Social Media Era, Self-Identification Through Intersectionality, Black Queer, Not Black and Queer, Not Black or Queer, Existing Fully is a Revolutionary Act. And a couple weeks ago, they presented Investigating Masculinities, the Art of Andre Terrell Jackson at the 17th Biennial Textile Society of America Symposium. Andre Terrell Jackson describes himself as a fiber artist mining their personal identity to create work at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. Pulling from their artist statement, I contemplate what it means to be beautiful as a Black person when Blackness as an idea and construct has been used to dehumanize people and traits associated with Blackness have been deemed undesirable. When we talk about race, it is often in relationship to whiteness, in which whiteness is the normalizer. Instead of centering whiteness, I center myself in order to normalize my experience as a Black queer person. By exploring my intersecting identities, I begin to work through my own perceived contradictions of self. Please join me in welcoming Andre Terrell Jackson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is an honor to be here to talk about my work. First, I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank you all for being here. So I will jump right into it by sharing my screen. Just give me 1 second. So once again, thank you so much. This is the art of Andre Terrell Jackson, who is me. Fiber art at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. So I have broken down the areas of my practice so that you can more easily understand and follow my thinking as an artist, as well as the relationship between the different areas that I work in. So I identify as a fiber artist, but there are a lot of different places that I'm pulling from. I have a background in theater, specifically costume design, as well as performance, and a history in fashion design, as well as fine art. And so I'm going to start with clothing and print. And so the print you're seeing here on this title slide is actually a BlackBerry print that I designed for clothing that is a reference to some poetry I wrote in which I talk about reclaiming or claiming power. That is a theme in my work that I think a lot of people probably can relate to, um, in which, as a Black queer person, I feel like I need to name myself, tell people who I am. If any of you have watched Lovecraft Country, you might relate to Hippolyta naming herself. And so this is the clothing. As you can see, there is a reference to many things. So on the first layer, what what should be apparent is a kind of mixing and matching of prints, fabrics, and hopefully what's kind of obvious is a mixing of gender. This piece is called My Gender is Black. And it's a reference to an article by Hari Zayed in which they talk about how, as being a Black person, they already have a different understanding of gender. They already don't have access to the ideas of gender that intersect with whiteness. If any of you are familiar with kind of any of the Black feminist or womanist works, you'll understand how Black feminists and Black womanists describe their relationship to Blackness and womanness, and how sometimes those two things can kind of negate each other because they are not men and they are not white and they are not white women. And so as a Black queer person, especially as a Black non-binary queer person, oftentimes our identities are ones that we have to make up ourselves. And so in this piece, I'm trying to contend with this idea that, what is masculine, what is feminine, what is Black, and what does it mean to express all of that in fashion? And so there's a lot of references to sportswear, a lot of references to the South, because at the time I was in graduate school in the South, and my family is from the South, both sides, descendants of slaves, enslaved African people. And so while I was in Savannah, I discovered these two houses. The house on the left is the King Tisdale Cottage, and the house on the right is one of the tabby houses on Ossabaw Island. And the interesting part for me about these two houses is that people lived in them at the exact same time. The tabby houses were occupied by descendants of the people who built them well into the 80s. And the King Tisdale Cottage also had people living there until the 80s. The interesting thing about the King Tisdale Cottage and why, first of all, why it has a name and why it's worth noting is that it was one of the first houses that African Americans were able to buy in Savannah. And it has an interesting history because it is now a museum, and it is the benefactor of the work of civil rights leaders to not only save the local history, but put money into educating people on why these things are important. And so to me, it represented a really interesting part that we don't really talk about in terms of, the Black experience, is that this is not, we get from point A to point B to point C and now we're free. This is a long journey in which we get here and it's 400 years of back and forth, push and pull. And as a contemporary artist, it's important that we, as a contemporary Black artist, it's important that I pull back the lens a little bit and look in the past and say, what's at play here that is still working now? And I think that that is represented by the histories of these two houses and how they intersect. And so what I did was I took these two houses, I blended them in Photoshop. I then printed that out and then cut them into strips and wove them and then manipulated them again to create a print for a clothing that also had deep meaning. Because to me, these two houses represent a place that doesn't necessarily exist. They represent a lot of ideas about the home and about safety that also doesn't really exist. Um, if you went inside the Tabby house, it is like really bare. And it's just interesting to think about people living there in a modern age. The King Tisdale cottage is, it's gorgeous. It's gorgeous architecture. It actually was a model home for the construction company that King Tisdale family were able to purchase. So it's just really an interesting thing to think about because it's like there's these people are free, but it's incremental access to really what we all deserve, which is dignity and ability to have life. And so trying to figure out how to express all of those ideas within clothing was just really important to me because, again, I have a background in fashion and I wanted to kind of push on like what can be said about race, gender, and sexuality in clothing. And so here are some detail shots so that you can see what other details I'm kind of pulling in to layer in these different areas. And that's how I start to get at those intersecting identities. And so you can see that there's a lot of text because I wrote a lot of different poems and used them in different ways because I wanted to play around with kind of trends in fashion. Excuse me. And so you'll see this phrasing that says, not mammy, not Sambo, which is one of the lines in one of the poems I wrote called Cognitive Dissonance. And it becomes this like branding for this clothing. And it's, this way of kind of talking about ownership and, branding and speaking a little bit to the commodity that the Black body is and was. And so I fast forward a little bit and I'm starting to think about the experience, once again, the experience of being, having these identities that are allegedly separate. I think sometimes sometimes we only think of people with their one marginalization. And as those marginalizations compound, it's like, well, you have to choose one. And people with multiple marginalizations do not experience their marginalizations at one time. They experience them compound. And so I started to think about like, what does it mean to kind of blend two identities and what does it mean to compound them? And so I discovered these black and white photos that my great aunt had taken in Trenton, New Jersey in the late 80s. And I just thought they were like these gorgeous photos. And I knew I wanted to work with them. And I said, I need to pair them with something. And so I went out and took some photos of Trenton that I thought were, beautiful and representative of kind of similar ideas to what my great aunt was capturing. And so that became these prints, which then became this robe. And so there's a lot of references to quilting and piecing because that's one of the fiber arts that has a strong Black history, but also because my great aunt is a quilter. And so to be able to piece together her images, piece together my images, and then cut them apart and piece them back together to think about how really, that's how I have to piece together my identity. And that's how I think about it. And so, the color and the black and white coming together into the body of this robe are really speaking of kind of these shared cultures, these shared identities, or these disparate identities coming together to create a Black queer identity. And this piece is called All Black Lives Matter, because I wanted to talk about not just what the Black experience is in relation to oppression, but also the erasure of queer and trans people that eventually happens within our movements for liberation. We can talk about police brutality, but then we forget. We get real quiet about the murder of Black trans women. That is also an epidemic. We don't talk about trans people that much. Tony McDade, we got real silent about that because he is a trans man, and so this is a way to also speak to the fact that because these two identities can sometimes be at odds, we leave a lot of people, in the crosshairs, and those are important people that we need for all of us to get free. And so I would like to move into my weavings, because it's one of the ways that I kind of leave the body and talk a little bit more cerebrally about some of these concepts, because the weavings, I think, require a little bit more kind of a investigation, because it's much more about kind of the materiality and kind of what's happening kind of through process than necessarily about kind of what's happening as opposed to the fashion. There's just a different way of thinking about it. And so this piece that's shown here is called Genotype Phenotype. And I had done a 23andMe and kind of took the results of that and created this piece that was about kind of weaving together these different threads, so that in varying degrees, Black is becoming the most prominent color within this weaving, but it's also you can also see that there's a place where there's not as much Black, and so those are the places where there's this other DNA, but like I'm still a Black person, and I think that is begins to think about the fact that there is no really one type of person. We all are sharing these kind of different histories, and so then on top of that, I've woven in text that is referencing queerness, Black queerness specifically, and where does that fit in terms of identity? Because it's like, I can take this test and find out I'm Black and white and whatever else, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I am actually those things. Like it is race is also cultural. Race is also a social construct in the same way that sexuality and gender are. And so that was like an important conversation to have there. And so with this piece, I'm playing around a little bit with our concepts of difference. And so on the right or on the left, there's the kind of white and beige piece. And then on the right, you've got this purple piece. And these are actually the same piece. One is just dyed, over dyed. And so I played around with fiber reactive dyes and using cotton and wool yarns, because one is a cellulose fiber and one is a protein fiber, and they take the fiber reactive dye differently. And thinking about how that is kind of our construction of race in a lot of ways, and our construction of a lot of identities. It's, I'm going to take we're all pretty much the same, but then those small differences is how we kind of decide, well, they're worth demonizing because they do things this way. They love other men, or they love other women, or they think they're men, but we say they're women. And so to kind of get an idea of, those concepts, um, and to play around a little bit with the kind of graphic quality of language. So these are Adinkra symbols that have been blown up and layered, and intersected with English text that I wrote. And then these two pieces are kind of similar, and they related to the last piece in that where the Adinkra symbols become this blown up large print, and the text becomes kind of the focus. Here, the focus is on the Adinkra symbols, with the text kind of blending into the background. And these pieces are both in reference to a diasporic Black identity, in two kind of separate ways. The Moonlight is kind of my idea of this kind of future where there is a better understanding and a better blending and a better conversation between all people within the African diaspora about our shared history and our disparate histories. And on the right, kind of the opposite of that. And so these are also me taking advantage of technology, because these are done on a Jacquard loom. And so I can weave the same exact image and then play around with how it ends up looking. And so rather than kind of weaving with the, so there's a white warp and then weaving it with the blue thread, versus the white warp weaving it with a red thread or a couple of red threads, and then over dyeing that with black to kind of change the prominence of certain details, so that these two pieces can kind of be in conversation, as well as stand on their own to have kind of very different things to say. Because to me, the blue and the white are subdued, and the red and the black are much more kind of abrasive. And I think that right now, conversations between diasporic peoples can be really difficult, because it's, especially for African Americans who don't have access to kind of a history, because that connection was cut off when we were enslaved, our ancestors were enslaved. And so here's just a detail shot so you can understand, without having to, I guess, see it up close, you kind of understand what's happening with the weave structures. Because this is all just woven. There's no other really process besides the dye. And so there's a reference to strip weaving, a reference to just different ideas of patterning. And so once again, like that fashion idea is coming in to kind of talk about, symbology and kind of like what we would call conspicuous consumption. Those are kind of, for me, the modes I'm using to kind of enter into these kind of more difficult conversations with hopefully some nuance. And in this piece, I wanted to play around with this idea of not really being able to open up and understand. And so a lot of the weavings have text that's not easily consumed or comprehended, as a representation of kind of what we're doing now. I can kind of tell you all of this and give you context, but it's hard to understand someone else's experience that you have not lived. And so in that way, this two-layer weaving in which you can see through this piece, and you can see through to the text. And on the other side, you can actually see the text, but it's backwards and it's in cursive, and it's, it takes more time and understanding, in the same way that our conversations about race, about gender, about sexuality require time and patience and understanding, and as well as empathy. And so on the face, we have this woven structure that is meant to um, replicate in a much simpler form a pieced quilt top. And then again, in the back, we have text, and that weaving was done with a with fishing line, so that I could pull open the threads so you could see those, see directly through. You can see some of that light is reflecting off of those threads, and so that's kind of what's holding it together. And so close up, you can see once again those threads and how they catch the light. And then as you get closer, you can see the different weave structures that are giving the illusion of pieced fabric. And so that is very prominent within my work, is that piecing. And because it represents to me these first ideas about remixing and hip hop. And so I talk about that a lot. Because that is one form of music that really, it just represents my modern idea of kind of what Black culture is all about. It's we can often take what we get, we put it together differently, and then it becomes something else. And that is what I'm trying to touch at a little bit. And I also just love talking about hip hop because as a Black queer person, we're always in it, but we're also always excluded from it. And so I try to make a point to talk about it because we are here, and that is also a very large part of the culture for us as well. And so these are just some sample weavings of our, just a sampling of weavings that I talked about in my presentation for the Textile Society Biennial, that are called Queerly Suited. And so these are each designs that are about kind of paring down some of the trickiness of my weavings, where I'm relying a lot on the technology to do the conversation around difficult topics. Excuse me. These are an exploration in how simple can I get to talk about, the ideas of masculinity, Blackness, Black manhood, and queerness. And so these are all striped or plaid prints that are, or structures that are named after Black queer artists and writers. And so artists like Joseph, or writers like Joseph Beam, Essex Hemphill, and Julian Isaac, or Isaac Julian. And so through paring down and like getting more simple, can I still represent those ideas just through these simple structures? And I think within that context, you can kind of start to understand our ideas about suiting and our ideas about what men wear. We can start to kind of question, where does that come from, and kind of why. And so within that presentation, I talked about kind of the history of Black people in America who had no relationship to the style of masculinity that we see as normal here, in terms of patriarchal masculinity. And so that those are things that had to be learned, and they are performed. And so to kind of think about, if you can kind of take it a step further and think about, these fabrics in relation to the suit, and, start to put them together into like an outfit, it starts to become almost ridiculous. And really that's kind of my idea about all of these roles we kind of force people into. It is kind of ridiculous. It is very much a piecing together of ideas. And so in that way, these kind of simple structures can start to have deeper conversations. And so the next little part of my process is the headpieces. Um, these are wearable sculptures that I've made to reference Black women and femme icons, reference Black hair as signifier, as well as Black beauty, which which for me personally comes through how Black women express themselves specifically. I was raised by my mom and my grandmother, and those are the people that represent beauty to me. Excuse me. And so through the headpieces, I'm trying to get at this idea of um, me, a Black queer non-binary person, having a relationship to Black femmes and having access to self-esteem through the self-esteem I see in others. And this piece is called Williams, which is a reference to Serena and Venus Williams, and thinking about hair adornment, um, braids. Um, when Serena and Venus wore their beaded hair, that was an issue and a problem. But for Black America, that was, a representation of our culture and a beautiful moment in time. And to be able to reference that in this piece and to kind of have it as, a piece of art was really important to me. And there's a lot of different references here in terms of using paint to create these kind of striped portions that become like beads or like the mud used in one of the cultures within the African continent, as well as there's some silicone on the ends. You'll see more of this piece a little bit later. And so with the headpieces, there also is the headpiece series, which is a photo series in which I use the headpieces to take photos of different people within them. I use them in a number of self-portraits as well, which you'll see a little bit later. And so my idea behind this was to really think about how the body can interact with the headpieces and how the headpieces can interact with the body. And so for these portraits, I usually ask people to come dressed in Black or gray. I don't tell them what to wear, I just tell them what color to wear. And so they bring themselves to the shoot. Um, and then I put the headpieces on them, and then they get to decide kind of how they interact with it. And it becomes a conversation between them and the headpiece. And then once I have multiple people and then I can put them together so that you can start to think about how these two people are different and how the headpiece feels different on different people, because that is kind of how identities work, is that we're all different, but we're all putting on pretty much the same things, especially culturally. And that's how we get culture. We have a shared aesthetic, a shared idea, shared values. And so not only do the headpieces get to interact with each other, they get to interact with with the people. They also get to interact with each other. And so this is a different headpiece called Tank, and it's a reference to Tank and the Bango's lead singer, Tank. And it is using kind of multiple processes and materials to kind of represent kind of an abstract idea about locks. And so I've felted some of my hair with wool, which I dyed using Kool-Aid. I used a pink lemonade and lemonade Kool-Aid to get that orangey color. And I stuffed those into vinyl tubes. There's also different sizes and colors of beads, silicone, glitter. And then again, my hair is actually on top, or is integrated into the silicone. And so it's just like this kind of abstract futuristic idea of hair. And so within my body of work, I sometimes am referencing Afrofuturism as a means of kind of celebration and escapism in a way. It's like I can imagine this world where um, instead of having to celebrate myself, I'm already celebrated as a Black queer person. There already is reverence for Black queer people, as opposed to us having to kind of wait around to be recognized, or or only celebrate ourselves. Because I mean that's what we do. When you're a marginalized culture, you find ways to celebrate yourself. You find ways to have dignity amongst yourselves. And so this is my imagination of a future where you know we don't have to wait to celebrate ourselves. We don't have to celebrate ourselves. Instead, we can celebrate ourselves and be celebrated. Um, and so once again, putting the headpieces on different people, including myself, and what's the reference? How does it feel? I mean, the nice thing about having kind of a larger head is that it also creates a different feeling on other people's bodies because they often have smaller heads. And so, for me, the picture on the right kind of reminds me of kind of some of those like 1940s little hats that are kind of like bowl shaped. Um, that I think is just like a funny kind of way to look at it. Especially because after I just talked about all this like Afrofuturism and like this idea of the future. But again, you're seeing how different bodies bring different identifications to the headpieces. And so you can also see how the headpieces are just very different and have different personality, and are able to reference different things when they're together as well. And so in this headpiece, which I call Walker, which is a reference to Alice Walker, who had this really famous quote that womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender. Um, and to think about these ideas of rather than this kind of binary idea of gender, that's like it's just many shades of the same thing. And then, excuse me, taking the sequined yarn and then taking washers and nuts and treating them as sequins as well, and spray painting them, excuse me, with this metallic teal and this glitter green color, and kind of transforming them from this kind of utilitarian item, this kind of masculine um, assumed item for the construction purposes, and turning them into something that is very frivolous. Um, and thinking about how just kind of how to turn kind of those gender assumptions on their head a little bit. And then the silicone, once again, here is used as reference to the scalp and used as reference to the body. And then how it looks different again on how other people wear it and what they do and how they interact with it. And just also how it just sits on the head is different also depending on how people decide to wear it. It's just it kind of takes on a life of its own. And that's what I kind of love about working with the headpieces, is because I have one idea of them as they're made, and then they take on life once they're completed, but then they take on new life when they're on other people's heads versus my head, and it becomes a great conversation between artist and subject, or in which sometimes I think that the models become the artists themselves. Is it gonna play? I guess I have to push play.
I am sweet pixie fairy, a blackberry, my words dragged to slurry. I am queen empress, serving my best. Impressed? Not yet. I am fresh brewed tea, Darjeeling, sugary sweet, come drink. I am head bitch, my hip switch, supreme witch, black magic. I am parasol, hard to control, my tongue's quick, my lips bold. We are blackberries, daintily scary, lace pansies, excuse the carry.
And so that was a video that I made to explore kind of performance and get some of the movement of these pieces. Because obviously the still shots can't capture all of the movement, all the personality, but also to blend in some of the text orally that you've seen kind of woven throughout in the clothing and in the weavings. Um, and so once again, kind of layering different parts of my practice to kind of have new conversations, different conversations. Um, and then finally, I would like to also talk about self-portraits because that is kind of the more recent work that I've made, and kind of out of necessity, putting myself in front of the camera and taking one of the things I like to do is take the different parts of my practice and then figure out how I can reuse them out of necessity, because once you kind of spend all these hours making something, you want to try to get as much mileage out of it as possible, but also because it's just fun to like kind of play around with how I use something. And so this is, on this portrait you can see that woven fabric from earlier used as costume with some jewelry pieces that I got from my grandma, which I'm sure she's not actually super happy about. But playing around with putting a character on these alter egos, and so taking the robe and putting it on the beach, taking this headpiece to the beach and embodying a different character. My one of my artist friends said that this reminded them of Mami Wata. And definitely am embodying the spirit of the water, relationship to water, relationship to a feminine identity, and really kind of celebrating my fat body. One of the things about kind of being online is that you meet other artists, and I've met a lot of artists who work with the body and fatness, and being fat artists using themselves or using other fat subjects. As opposed to non-fat artists using fat artists to talk about fat bodies. And so once again, kind of celebrating a marginalized identity. And using myself also because it's easier to do. I can take a photo of myself whenever I want. And then once again, exploring just different ways of photographing myself, and using just kind of exploring different ways of creating characters. On the left, in my mind, I'm creating this kind of warrior character, and on the right, this kind of demure, kind of soul bluesy character, and it just is like this. Tapping into my performance roots, and in a way. And then these final photos, exploring just different references here and exploring softness. And in this photo on the left, I'm referencing so many things, but I like to think about, the Hottentot Venus and how her body was seen as a kind of marvel and a grotesque marvel at the same time. I mean, if you're denoting her as Venus and referencing the goddess of beauty, but you're also caging her and saying that look at this weird body. Like I have this desire for this thing that I also want to subjugate, and that's really a conversation about Black bodies in general. And yeah, I'll leave it there, but that is how I'm using my body to have conversations about Black bodies in general, fat bodies specifically. Thank you.
Oh, yay. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We've had a lot of activity in the chat, and I will share the chat with you later too, but a couple of things came up that I thought were good here. All y'all think about your questions, because you can be asking live. I'm just gonna, in the meantime, just say a couple things from the chat. So Zola Mumford said, these headpieces are fascinating. In the US, Black hair and even hair coverings, i.e. the 19th century Tignon in New Orleans, have historically been critiqued to the point where legislation was needed in California to protect the possibility of natural hair being worn in the workplace. So it's wonderful that an Afrofuturist headpiece is part of your work. Freedom of future hair and future thought. So
That is exactly it. Like 1000%. It's a celebration of locks specifically, because locks are definitely one of the most policed hairstyles in this country specifically. And so to think about a future where you get to wear your hair how you want, how it grows out of your head naturally, and what how you can wear it for the kind of the safety of the hair and and you know, also, you know, for beauty. Absolutely.
great. There is a question from D'Antonio Thomas. Do you have a piece that you would describe as the most you? Or I suppose, which one would be the most iconic for you?
I think that the piece I shared on the weaving slide is one of my favorites, the genotype phenotype piece, simply because I think it does represent me the most. I mean, I guess in some ways it's kind of the most intimate piece that is very much specific to me and my experience through that 23andMe process. But other than that, I think honestly the headpieces as a whole, because like I said, I literally wear each of them as I'm making them to kind of see, like, is this the direction I want to go in with how this looks? You know, I'm the first model to put them on.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I like the idea that you're like coming up against power, right? Like you're reclaiming power. You're also sort of like just hitting up against the power structures that exist. So absolutely beautiful. And I thank you for your work.
I have a quick
Thank you.
question. Can I?
Hi.
We're asking, right? Not just chatting. All right. Hi, Andre.
Hello.
Anyways, I love seeing all that work again and to see what you've been doing with it. So I think it's actually really, I have the history. There's a number of grad students and seniors that are here right now, just so you know, Andre. And I really love seeing how you took that work when you no longer had the fancy looms and the fancy equipment and continued to make work with it. And I think that that's a like really sort of great and powerful sort of statement about how to keep going forward after you leave, you know, the academic institution, as well as the way you've continued the academic side of your writing and your thinking about history. And actually, so that was just a compliment. Thank you very much. And then here's the question. So it's interesting because when you showed those last images, I immediately started thinking about those West African portrait photographers. And I actually just had to look it up because one of my friends from Seattle actually was chatting with me about that. And she and so I had to look up who it was. It's Seydou Keita is the person. Keita is the person I was thinking of. But there's a number of contemporary photographers who's also continued with that. And I never actually, before you introduced it right now, I never thought about how it does sort of speak to a certain kind of African aesthetic identity. So celebrating the different kinds of textiles, but those women and the men that are in those photographies are always of a kind of typical sort of beauty, right? And you have another typical beauty that is, or a non-typical beauty, I guess, that is also beautiful. So I was just wondering how you're thinking about the relationship that you have to those portraits, because it was so clear that you were referencing them.
Yeah, that's a great question. As someone who is slowly considering themselves a photographer, since I did not really start out that way, I am, you know, looking at how other photographers photograph themselves and also photograph other people. And so that's why I am kind of talking about those references now, because it's like, how has the Black body been photographed before is, like, I think, super important, in the same way that I'm thinking about referencing different styles of Black art in terms of, piecing in relation to weaving, piecing in relation to quilting, kente cloth in relation to weaving or strip weaving. It's the same way I'm thinking about the photography, is what types of bodies have been photographed before and how have Black bodies been photographed before. And so because I am the subject of my photos, I think there's not as much of kind of a voyeuristic quality to them, but I still think that there is kind of this, I guess the best way I can say it right now is this kind of like, oops, I stepped into your personal space kind of moment, where it's like, this seems private. This seems like I kind of stepped into a moment where you were kind of luxuriating on yourself. And so that's kind of how I'm taking what other people are doing or have done and kind of turning it into my own kind of practice. Because to me, stepping in front of the camera, while also being a lot of work, is also a meditative practice.
Fabulous. Zola also says, yes, the fabric backgrounds in the self-portraits do impart some of the feeling of Malik Sidibe's studio portraits in Mali as well.
I just want to say that I think it's super smart that you are referencing, I think, of Nicolene Thomas, and there's so many artists right now that are referencing those portraits in relation to the French Impressionists and all of those sort of periods of time where the portraits were taking. And I do think that it's very smart that your references are as direct as they are, because immediately it made me actually start questioning even those references, which I think is working really well for you. And had I not known you as an artist and as a person, at first I was like, oh, that's really close, but it did make me question that. And I think that I'm excited to see how you go forward with that, Andre, because I think that whenever we can question the ways in which we think of something as being on the edge, and then we're sort of opened up to another edge to it. And I think that that's really powerful.
Thank you.
There's a question that someone asked in the chat that I thought was interesting. Do you have a daily practice, sketchbooking, writing?
I would not necessarily call it a daily practice, but I do very often. I have like a reading practice. I don't get to read daily, but I do read very, very, very often, because I am a writer. That is super important to actually what I make. And so all of those, I don't know if you could catch it a little bit, but as I was talking about all these things, I was referencing a lot of different work. Like I said, Hari Zayed and their piece, My Gender is Black. One of the things I meant to mention was Bell Hooks in her book, Art on My Mind. She talks about the power of photography for Black artists, or for Black people in general, to combat negative images within the media. They got to hold the camera and take pictures of themselves and of their life to normalize their experience. And so those readings start to become kind of central to how I start to think about the art that I want to make in relationship to what those scholars are saying, or what writers are writing about, kind of about their own experiences. And so, like, I'm referencing Essex Hemphill and Joseph Beam, who are, we lost both of them to AIDS complications. But they created one of the first anthologies of Black gay men's writings at a time when, during the AIDS epidemic, and at a time when those conversations were supposed to be kept quiet and in the closet. And so taking all of those readings and putting them together to talk about my experience, today has become kind of central. And so it's not a daily practice, but it is, and as often as possible, practice. I have 2 bookcases filled with books, so I try to read as much as possible.
I'm just reading from the chat. Kelda Martinson says, Andre, thank you for this presentation, so full of thought and love and talent. How has the pandemic impacted your way of collecting material and coming into your source material or your access to spaces? It's so interesting to hear how artists are working through this time and what inventions are occurring big and small in the studio.
The interesting thing about my practice is that I already work out of my house. Like all of the photos you see, all the photos that are kind of within a studio are literally taken in my bedroom. I set up the background and I set up the camera in a very small space, which is also probably why they're so intimate, because there's not a lot of room to be far away. There's not a lot of room to set it up kind of any other way. So I already do that. And so the pandemic has not necessarily made it harder to do that part of my practice, but closer to the beginning, it was hard to get material at all because, shipments were slower, places were having to shut down. So, now that we're kind of in this portion of the pandemic, it's a little easier to get materials into source materials, but still not necessarily super easy to do much else. Like I can't work with other people necessarily, because then, there's that risk of kind of us infecting each other and then them infecting more people. But generally speaking, I haven't had such a huge impact on my studio practice.
Oh, great. Somebody also asks, where can they find your written work? And I know there's some on Colorblock, right? Or
Yes. They're also on my website. If you go to the writing section, you can find the poems that I reference in this talk and my thesis paper, which is actually on my website. If you kind of scroll, well, actually there's a table of contents so you can see where it is in there. But basically, if you scroll kind of all the way to the bottom, well, maybe not all the way to the bottom, but near the end, all those poems are actually in there.
wonderful, thank you. There's also a question about someone appreciates your use of color. Do you feel direct connection to your environment, or do you go with your instinct?
For the most part, I go with my instinct. I probably should have talked a little bit more about color because it is actually really intentional. But I, generally speaking, like to use a lot of color if possible, and to use bright colors simply on the kind of surface level because I enjoy them. But on kind of a secondary level, I kind of segmented color to kind of utilize their kind of mood most, as well as kind of reference some parts of how they're using kind of other people's practice, generally speaking, with some of the blues and purples kind of being this kind of reference to a lot of Afrofuturist art, and some of the kind of more earthy tones being more of a kind of like modern take. That's also kind of generally speaking, but yeah, I generally am kind of using colors that I like, and kind of using them to their kind of fullest extent.
Thank you for your time. Thank you all for your time. And I really appreciate this. It's been fabulous. If there are more questions, please feel free to stay and ask.